all year round.
It's so mysterious.
This is who we are.
This is who we are.
WADR.
WADR, promoting dialogue.
It's midday in Dakar. Good afternoon and many thanks for staying tuned to West Africa Democracy Radio, broadcasting on 94.9 FM and around the world on WADR.org. This is Newslink. Here are the top stories. Nigerian Prime Minister Umudu chairs the first national mechanism meeting on early warning security risks. A European Union delegation to the Gambia concludes its mission with a satisfactory remark on ties between Banjul and Brussels.
We see the Gambia as a solid and reliable partner, but the purpose of our visit was to reaffirm not only the European Union's, but in particular the European Parliament's interest in further deepening our partnership with the Gambia.
The West African Civic Space Resource Center, WASI, holds a workshop in Dakar, Senegal, to help CSOs protect civic space.
What we are looking at is providing capacity building services and technical support to civil society organizations working around issues of civic space across West Africa, with specific attention to Senegal.
And Côte d'Ivoire receives an IMF board approval for project financing to the tune of $3.6 billion US. Please stay with us for details of these stories and more.
Here is James Ajapon with Newslink.
Thank you for joining us. We begin in Niger, where Prime Minister and Head of Government Umudu Mahamadou Wednesday chaired the first board meeting of the National Mechanism of Early Warning and Response to Security Risks in the country. The reorientation and monitoring meeting in Niamey aims to review the activities carried out by the National Response Center in order to define guidelines for the current year. Several heads of international institutions were in attendance. Matisi has more in this report by WADR's Niamey correspondent Mutala Zuberu.
Wednesday's meeting serves as a framework for evaluating the activities carried out by the National Response Center to better strategize for the year 2023. Chaired by Prime Minister Uhumudu Mahamadou, this is the very first meeting of the Orientation and Monitoring Board of the National Early Warning and Response Mechanism to Security Risks in Niger.
The National Warning Center proposes to develop an action plan for the period 2022 to 2024 and conduct several activities, including, among others, the establishment of a system of centralization of security data, the establishment of a monitoring system of extremist violence, and dissemination of analytical notes and bulletins on human security. The purpose of this first meeting of the National Council of Reorientation and Monitoring is precisely to assess the activities carried out by the Center and to give guidelines and directions based on the year 2021.
For the Vice President of the ECOWAS Commission, Damien Chinchibija, Niger enjoys the reverence of its peers with the support of the National Regional Institution. The ECOWAS Vice President added,
The inaugural session of the Statutory Orientation Council of the Early Warning and Response Mechanism of Niger is also the first meeting of its kind for this institution, which is vital for the proper functioning of the mechanism.
The National Response Center is a civilian structure attached to the Prime Minister's office whose mandate is to alert the government of potential threats to the population. Niger, like Mali and Burkina Faso, has been grappling with several security threats on its borderlines. On the stretches of the tri-border area and beyond, the country is fighting extremist affiliates with Al-Qaeda, and on the other end, fighting Boko Haram fighters with roots in Nigeria's northeastern region.
That was a report by WADR's Niamey correspondent Mutala Zuberu and voice in our studios by Marty C. The Togolese government says it is seeking new ways and advanced measures to counter terrorists who continue to ravage the Savannah region. Like its Sahelian neighbor, Burkina Faso, recent activities by extremists, especially in Togo's border communities, have killed many and displaced hundreds. Many of them continue to live in dire situations far from schools, health facilities, and limited access to food. Imo Edit completes the story.
Faced with a persistent terrorist threat, Togo continues to seek ways and means to reverse the trend in the Savannah region. These measures are planned to curb the raids of terrorist groups in the country's Penjal and Penjal West prefectures. Reports indicate that some terrorists are setting up camps in these localities. According to the state, the measures should take into account international cooperation of security forces, intelligence, strengthening border security, and many others. While developing international cooperation against the terrorist threat is crucial, Lome says it will work closely with neighboring countries to share information on terrorist groups and put in place coordinated security measures. They also plan to build the capacity of the security forces. At this level, the authorities plan to invest in training and equipping its security forces so that they better understand the terrorist threat and anticipate attacks. Public awareness campaign is also on the list of measures to be undertaken by the authorities to educate and enlighten the population on the dangers of terrorism and preventative measures.
Imo Edit filed that report. Away from that, the International Rescue Committee, RIC, is calling for innovative solutions to restore the right to aid and protection for millions of people in countries affected by armed conflict and climate change. These countries are Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Niger, and Nigeria. The new IRC West Africa Emergency Report, based on the watch list of the 20 countries most at risk of a new or worsening humanitarian emergencies, highlights alarming trends in deteriorating humanitarian crisis in the region. The committee has identified 3 factors that are accelerating crisis in the region, namely conflict, climate change, and economic turmoil. Hannah Gibbon is IRC Deputy Regional Director for West Africa.
So the International Rescue Committee has spent some time looking into what the different causes are of the humanitarian crisis across the Sahel region. And indeed, we've identified 3 key factors. So one of those is the conflict. And as the listeners will probably be aware, there's increasing dynamics of different groups. And really, the conflict has been deteriorating. Secondly, there's the situation of climate change. Climate change is obviously a phenomenon that is well known, but unfortunately it's aggravating the situation for the vulnerable populations. The third element is indeed the economic turmoil that's ongoing around the globe, and that's really again having a serious impact on the most vulnerable persons in these regions. So unfortunately, populations, because of these factors, are having to move. So sometimes people are having to leave their homes. They're having to leave behind some of their resources. They're leaving some of their social connections, and they're having to move to new places that for them are safer. Now, sometimes what this means is that in the places where they move to, there can be additional pressure on some of the local resources. So local resources such as access to water, and again, pressure on access to food.
That was Hannah Gibbon, IRC Deputy Regional Director for West Africa.
Fresh and breaking news all the time. Hear it first as the news breaks, only on West Africa Democracy Radio. Newslink continues.
If you are just tuning in, this is Newslink on West Africa Democracy Radio, broadcasting on 94.9 FM. Remember, we are streaming all around the world on WADR.org. Members of the European Parliament have described the Gambia as a solid and reliable partner, adding that ties between Banjul and Brussels are highly valued. The recommendation means that the Gambia will benefit from the EU's Global Gateway project. Our Banjul correspondent, Sankole Janko, has more.
A 6-man delegation of the European Parliament Committee on Foreign Affairs concluded a 3-day walking visit to the Gambia on Wednesday. The visit, according to the delegation, is meant to strengthen ties between Banjul and Brussels. Speaking to the press at the EU headquarters in the Gambian capital, head of the delegation, David McAllister, an EU member of parliament from Germany, describes the relations between the bloc and Banjul.
We see the Gambia as a solid and reliable partner, but the purpose of our visit was to reaffirm not only the European Union's, but in particular the European Parliament's interest in further deepening our partnership with the Gambia.
The top EU delegation also praised the Gambia's efforts with the transitional justice process.
Let me also underline that the Gambia is one of the countries that will benefit from the EU's Global Gateway projects to improve the infrastructure along the Praia-Dakar-Abidjan corridor.
Recall, the European Council had placed a temporary suspension of the application of certain provisions in the visa code for Gambians, in addition to the increased visa fee to €120 due to the country's lack of cooperation on the readmission of third country nationals illegally staying in the EU member states. Asked if the delegation and the Gambian authorities discussed the issue, Mr. McAllister replied, saying,
"In 2023, I certainly believe that the situation can, and let me add, should be rapidly reassessed."
Since the change of power in January 2017, the EU has been Gambia's biggest ally, allocating hundreds of millions of euros to various projects in the country.
Sankule Janko for that report. Away from that, Liberians have expressed dismay over a South Korean court sentencing Wednesday of 2 Liberian diplomats to 9 years in prison, each on the charge of sexual assault. The diplomats are Moses Owen Brown, Liberia's permanent representative to the International Maritime Organization, and Daniel Tarr, Director of the Department of Marine Environmental Protection at the National Maritime Authority. WADR's Darlington Pogba in Monrovia says the Liberian government is already consulting other legal options for the 2 representatives.
In September last year, 2 Liberians, namely Moses Owen Brown and Daniel Tarr, were arrested by South Korean authorities while attending a maritime conference in the country. They were charged with sexual assault. However, on Wednesday, April 5, 2023, the Liberian government issued a statement saying the 2 have been found guilty and sentenced to 9 years each in prison. In the statement, the government indicated that it is exploring various appeal options in South Korea over the sentencing. The Liberian government said it has instructed its legal representation in Korea to furnish it with various appeal options available to criminal defendants under Korean laws. The government has also established that any appeal from such a verdict has to be submitted no later than 7 days following the verdict. Meanwhile, the sentencing has sparked mixed reactions in the country as some Liberians believe the country's diplomatic image has been damaged while others differ.
Public official that representing Liberia at IMO, appointed by President Weah, 9 years in prison. You know what it means for you? Reputational damage of our country. That's what it means for our country. Reputational damage. The breakdown of country image.
Social emotions has its own way of doing things. The Liberian government under the presidency of George Manneh, we have condemned that act and we respectfully support the decision that yes, indeed, they should bear the consequences.
For now, the government has promised to facilitate the visit to South Korea each family member from Moses Brown and Daniel Tarr in the aftermath of the sentencing. For Newslink on WADR, I am Darlington Pogba reporting from Monrovia.
In other news, the West African Civic Space Resource Center, WASI, has commenced a 3-day workshop in Dakar, the Senegal capital, to help civil society organizations protect civic space. The workshop aims to equip participants with the necessary skills to influence state policies and resist restrictions. The educational event brought together 5 civil society organizations to discuss the various issues related to the civic space in Senegal. The participants are expected to gain a deep understanding of the civic space as well as the human rights and legal perspectives. Omolara Balogun, head of the Policy Influencing and Advocacy Unit at WASI, tells WADR more about the objectives of the workshop.
This is a 5-year initiative that we started last year with the support of Ford Foundation. And what we are looking at is providing capacity building services and technical support to civil society organizations working around issues of civic space across West Africa, with specific attention to Senegal, Nigeria, and Ghana. The idea for us is to enhance these organizations, strengthen their resilience, and which would in turn enable them to further push back these restrictions to civic space, to open society, to freedom and civil liberty across the different countries. The crop of participants that we have in the room do not only understand the Senegalese context, they understand the issues, and they have mastered the different manifestations of civic space disruption in Senegal, and they were able to speak to it, from the media repression, from attacks on dissent voices, from the legislation perspective. They also had a lot to share on how they have been responding to some of these restrictions.
Omolera Balogun is WASI's Head of Policy Influence and Advocacy. You are listening to Newslink on West Africa Democracy Radio 94.9 FM Dakar. Here's a reminder of our top stories. Nigerian Prime Minister Umudu chairs the first national mechanism meeting on early warning security risk. A European Union delegation to the Gambia concludes its mission with a satisfactory remark on ties between Banjul and Brussels. The West African Civic Space Resource Center, WASI, holds a workshop in Dakar, Senegal, to help CSOs protect civic space. And Côte d'Ivoire receives an IMF board approval for project financing to the tune of $3.6 billion. Still ahead, we have our newspaper review, guest interview, and some sports updates. Kindly stay with us.
West Africa Democracy Radio. It's you speaking.
If you are just tuning in, this is Newslink on West Africa Democracy Radio, broadcasting on 94.9 FM. Don't forget you can always follow our discussions on Twitter and Instagram at WADR News, and on Facebook, West Africa Democracy Radio English Service. Finally, Côte d'Ivoire has received approval from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, for the financing of projects to the tune of 2,000 billion CFA francs, or $3.6 billion. The development was communicated by the Ivorian government spokesperson, Amadou Coulibaly, at the end of the Council of Ministers on Wednesday in Abidjan. Tofik Abdul Nasir has more details.
The financial support, according to the government spokesperson, will make it possible to realize many developmental programs in Côte d'Ivoire. Amadou Coulibaly indicated that the financial institution approved the funds after due consultations. The agreement reached between the IMF and Abidjan allows for the disbursement of $3.6 billion, or just over 2,000 billion CFA francs, corresponding to 400% of the nation's budget. Appreciating the IMF for the timely approval, President Alassane Ouattara said such a level of financing reflects the confidence of the fund in Côte d'Ivoire. Ouattara urged the government to be more rigorous, to strictly respect the rules of good governance, and continue to strengthen the credit that inspires both the international donors and the Ivorian population. The head of state expressed gratitude for the country's resilience through the two recent major shocks, which he says are the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian-Ukraine war. According to data from the International Monetary Fund published in October 2022, debt service on the Ivorian budget was at 46%. Côte d'Ivoire, however, hopes to stabilize its economic growth, which stood at 6.8% in 2022.
Tofik Abdul Nasir for that report.
This is the newspaper review. Stay on top of the news. Get the most important stories with added insight and concise review.
This is the newspaper review.
Up next, we have our press stories from Accra, Ghana, with WADR Sotiawen and Bella Lawson.
Greetings from Accra and welcome to the newspaper review for today, April 6, 2023. Let's start off the review by looking at the Daily Guide newspaper. The screaming headline says 2024 presidential race, it is possible, says Baumia. And that's Vice President Dr. Mahmoud Baumia, who has hinted that he will be gunning to lead the New Patriotic Party into the 2024 presidential election. Then we have some kicker headlines. Supreme Court decides Boga MP's fate on May 17. Then there's another one. Nana Akufo-Addo swears in new justices and ministers. And then another kicker headline, $300 million arbitration against Ghana in limbo. So those are the headlines in the Daily Guide newspaper. Let's now go to the Daily Graphic newspaper. The screaming headline, love, forgiveness, honesty must reign supreme. Church leaders are urging Ghanaians as the country starts to mark the Easter celebrations. Then we have some banner headline, CSOs call for 2 EC appointees to resign. Then we have another headline here, decisions of the Supreme Court critical for national development. That's according to President Akufo-Addo. And then we have some more banner headlines, rote learning not helpful. That's according to the University of Ghana Vice Chancellor. So those are the headlines in the Daily Graphic newspaper. Let's now bring you some business stories. The Business Analyst, the screaming headline, tension brewing at the Maritime Authority. According to our sources, things may get out of hand if the authorities concerned do not move swiftly to address these issues. So that's the screaming headline there. Then we have a banner headline. The headline says, debt restructuring, Ghana yet to make progress with common framework debt treatment. Then we have another banner headline, Ghana Water Company to go after consumers as debt stands at 800 million Ghana cedis this year. And then an international story here about US President Donald Trump. And allegedly he says the US is going to hell. So that's it for the Business Analyst newspaper. And that's how we end the newspaper review for today. My name is Atiewin Imbila Lawson. Back to you in the studio.
Thank you, Atiewin, for that newspaper review.
Politics,
Analysis on major news,
social matters, and all. This is A Guest.
On our guest segment today, a Liberian human rights activist examines the legal and diplomatic implications following the sentencing of 2 Liberian diplomats to 9 years in prison over sexual assault by the South Korean government. The 2 diplomats, namely Moses Owen Brown and Daniel Tao, all representatives of Liberia's international maritime authorities, were arrested in September last year while discharging their official duties. Adama Dempster, who is our guest in this chat, will delve into the human rights infringement issues of these diplomats. Another point of concern is whether this will affect the reputational national identity and image, as many have described it in Liberia. Dempster tells WADR more.
So, first of all, I would say any form of sexual assault or criminal offense that are condemnable, from a human rights standpoint, because we, from a human rights angle, call for respect, call for protection, and to an extension that no forms of abuse should be melted against any group of people in society. But be as it is, when they were initially charged allegedly for sexual assault in Korea, the 2 Liberian diplomats, whom I know one of them very well, it came as an unfortunate feedback from their own international tax or role that they should have played on the international scene. But moreover, there are international immunity that covers diplomats. And in the context of that, we thought that the Liberian government will exploit that diplomatic means, not necessarily that they should be released. But now I was informed that the government did send representatives from Liberia to actually represent them legally. But in the process of adjudicating or hearing the case, we have been waiting to get feedback in the context of legal representation and what approach that the government and the Korean government have been having relating to this whole diplomatic issue, until we have heard today that a verdict and a sentence that have been reached. But it still remains an issue that can still be appealed to be able to give more reasonable insight about that case relating to giving a full information to the public, the family, convincing that the verdict rendered by the South Korean government is indeed appropriate.
So, as a human rights activist, do you see this verdict as an infringement of the diplomatic immunity of these diplomats, and also in terms of reputational damage to national identity and image, as many have described in Liberia?
I think reputational damage, I would say, is unfortunate, and that should not even happen, and that should not even be coming out of diplomatic missions. On the other aspect, I think that legality must always be respected, must be applied. But let it be applied from a credible standpoint, that is, a process of fairness and transparency be applied. But again, the government of Liberia, their own approach, their own diplomatic negotiation is yet to be fully communicated to the Liberian public as to what they put forward to have sustained and maintained that international humanity is respected. Unfortunately, we have not got an explanation in that direction. So I would say that there are always opportunities for appeal. And in the appeal, that can be also looked at going forward from this case.
So, Mr. Adama, finally, obviously 9 years is not 9 months or 9 days. So will the South Korean court ruling affect the foreign relations between Seoul and Monrovia?
So that's another aspect. I know there have been Korean and there are Korean relations with Liberia, and there are a lot of Korean businesses that are operating in the country. So going back to both country foreign relations, I believe in that diplomatic cycle, that diplomatic angle, there can be more conversation as to what would be appropriate stand or final decision going forward in the close of this identical case. But again, in diplomatic and foreign relation matters, the conversation does not just start from just what has happened. But I'm aware that family members of the both convicts, I will put it that way, I've been welcome to visit them in Korea, including government representatives. So the Foreign Ministry, the Ministry of Justice, and the Maritime Authority are going to be making a trip to South Korea. And I believe that is also in the diplomatic conversation. But however, until we get feedback, we still look forward to the feedback and the conversation that comes from between the two countries.
Adama Dempster is a human rights activist in Liberia. And here is Sankole Janko with some sports updates.
Oh, that warm welcome and thank you for joining us. Cameroon international Joel Embiid was the standout player after helping his NBA side Philadelphia 76ers overcome Boston Celtics 103-101. The stellar performance saw Embiid registered his fifth 50-point game in his career. The 29-year-old has been the standout performer for the 76ers in the NBA this season. In football, record champions Al Ahly have been drawn against Morocco's Raja Casablanca in the quarterfinals of the Total Energies CAF Champions League for a second consecutive season. This comes after the North African giants were paired against each other in Wednesday evening's quarterfinal draw. Raja will hope to seek revenge after losing to the Egyptian giants 3-2 on aggregate at the same stage last season. Also in the quarterfinals, defending champions with the Raja club will face off with Tanzanian side Simba SC. South Africa's Mamelodi Sundowns have been drawn against Algerian side CR Belouizdad. The quarterfinals are scheduled for the weekend of April 21 to 22. The semis will be played on May 12 to 14, with the second leg a week later according to CAF official website. And Gambia's Scan A Secondary School earned a 1-1 draw against the host Ndala Technical High School in the CAF School Championship opener on Wednesday. And that's it for sports. It's back to you.
Thank you, Sankole, for that sports update. We have come to the end of this edition of Newslink from West Africa Democracy Radio, broadcasting from Dakar, Senegal. Thank you for listening, and many thanks to our listeners in the Gambia via Hot 104.3 FM and in Liberia via Alternative Youth Radio 98.9 FM Lofa County. And in Ghana, Royals FM 104.7. Wenchi Inyas Belimu has been exceptional on the console. Many thanks to Mustafa Sek for our Facebook Live coverage. Do interact with us via our social media platforms on Twitter, Instagram at WADR News, and on Facebook, West Africa Democracy Radio English Service. Coming up at the bottom of the hour is WADR's Environment Program, Enviroscope rebroadcast with Abdullah Hassan. I am James Ejapon. Good afternoon.
News,
Talk, music,
get it all 24 hours on West Africa.